Good afternoon. Greetings, everybody. I'm glad to see you all here. I'm Danielle Allen, the director of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics, and this is the second of our public lectures for the fall. And it's my pleasure to be welcoming Julian Savulescu this evening. This lecture is a partnership as an effort between the bioethics folks in the medical school and Bob Trugg's group there and us here at the center. So Professor Savulescu has been on campus for nearly a week giving talks in a variety of contexts. So he is the director of the Uehiro Center for Practical Ethics in Oxford, and he holds the Uehiro Chair in Practical Ethics. He is a doctor by training initially and also earned a PhD at Monash University in 1994, working with Peter Singer. So he is leading bioethicist at Oxford, working especially on issues of genetic selection and moral enhancement. In a recent paper, he is, among other things, actually the editor of the Journal of Medical Ethics and plays a role on several other important journals of medical ethics. And the Journal of Medical Ethics published a paper recently called Bioethics, Why Philosophy is Essential for Progress. And it's a short but very powerful paper indicating all the places and ways in which the work of the medical profession, both in terms of research and practice, necessarily involves values, necessarily involves ethics, even, for example, in the very basic choice of research questions. And consequently, this is, as you all know, one of the hardest domains there is, I think, for practical ethics. Add to that the fact that technological advances make things possible that were unimaginable very recently. And it's no surprise at all that this should be an area where we need philosophy more than any other in some sense. And also that it should be an area where it's as hard as possible. It's the hardest place, I think, to do good philosophy. And also, of course, the place where philosophical work is the most contested and most contestable, because the questions of bioethics, medical ethics go so profoundly to the foundation of what we understand human life to be about. So these are the kinds of topics that a center like the Safra Center needs to engage in and help us all find ways to think analytically and carefully about so that we can make decisions that are justified on these incredibly hard issues. We will be hearing from Professor Savulescu on the subject of disability and difference. And again, he's going to take us, I think, into some very challenging territory. And so we will be looking forward, as we always are, to a spirited, thoughtful conversation at the end of this. It's in, I think, our dialogue with one another that we do our most significant and important philosophic work. And I'm delighted that you're all here to make this effort to think our way through these incredibly difficult issues, a collective effort, something that none of us is trying to do individually, but an effort in which we are trying to, in fact, weave together the voices and understandings that emerge from a variety of different kinds of training and experience and perspective. And so with that, Professor Savulescu, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Allen. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Harvard. I'd like to thank the Safra Center and also the Center for Bioethics for making this possible. I just thought I'd start with a couple of personal experiences because I don't have any standard disabilities of the sort that you think I'm going to discuss, although I'll offer the view that all of us have disabilities in a moment. But I do have asthma, and I've had that since I was very young. And when I started having asthma, there wasn't really any treatment except for oral steroids. And I was very sick. I missed most of the early part of school and was nearly kept down because of this asthma. And initially I was given a lot of antibiotics, tetracyclines, which stained my teeth, turned them black. And eventually I had courses of steroids and was able to return to school. But as a part of that history, I was encouraged to swim very early on, and I did a lot of swimming, a lot of laps. such that by the age of about 8, I could swim about 3 kilometres, and I used to love water sports, and I got very involved in surfing, and surfing has given me some of the greatest pleasures of my life, and I continue to enjoy my relationship with the sea. So would my life have gone better if I didn't have asthma? I think it's a very difficult question to answer, and it's quite possible it wouldn't have gone better. So I'm very sensitive to the view that impediments like asthma can bring about lives that couldn't be better. In fact, I think my life is going about as good as it could possibly go. I've got a great life, and I feel very fortunate to have had it, despite the obstacles I've faced. But when thinking about choosing my children, genetic testing of embryos, treating asthma in my children, I can't just think about how my life has gone. I have to think about how, on average, whole populations of people's lives can go. And in that sense, I would treat asthma in my children. In fact, I have treated asthma in one of my daughters, and I would select embryos that don't have a disposition towards asthma. And that's not because I think that asthma is a terrible condition. It's just that it's an obstacle, and there are plenty of ways to have the sort of life that I've had without that obstacle. We have to value lots of states of affairs besides so-called disabilities, and one that I've been reflecting upon is my children. So I got divorced, I think, 10 years ago this year, and I've wondered whether that was good for my children. And there's lots of models of bringing up children today. There's single parents, there's gay parents, there's divorced parents, there's the usual heterosexual couple that stay together. So there's lots of models, and you might ask yourself, which is the best model for bringing up a child? So I asked my daughter, who was 16, do you think it was the right thing for me to separate from your mother? And she said, absolutely. I'm so glad that you did it. I'm really happy. It was the right decision, and I'm happy. And that was very reassuring for me. I felt much better that she said that. But in evaluating my decision, I want to know other things about how happy she is. I think it's important that she's happy, and she continues to be happy, but I want to know what the quality of her relationships are in the future, how she goes in her education, what kind of job she gets, what she's able to do with her life, a whole bunch of other things besides just whether she's happy and satisfied with her decision. She may also have access to unique kinds of goods as a result of the history that she's had. She may have a very intense relationship with her mother. But whether overall her life has gone better or worse depends on many factors. And even if it went as well as it could possibly go, that wouldn't answer the question of whether divorce and separation is good or bad for children. You'd have to study hundreds, thousands of children and compare them to other forms of bringing up children. And the last point that I want to make, and I'll try and bring these back to the debate topic in a moment, is that I completely agree with the advocates of the social model of disability and disability advocates that we have to learn from other people's experiences. About 15 years ago, I was a part of a project that was following up surgery at the Children's Hospital on children with intersex conditions. And being a doctor, having a medical training, I believed at that time the right thing to do was to create an anatomically defined sex, and that usually means creating a vagina and an anatomical appearance of being a female, because that gives the best level of sexual function. But having talked to people from the intersex community, and as a part of that study, I changed my mind. And my view now is that children, if I had a child with an intersex condition, I wouldn't perform an operation, I wouldn't perform the assignment surgery, in virtue of their description of their experiences. But now I want to talk about disability as you standardly understand it. And Frances has heard at the start of this talk, so don't panic, Frances, you're here. She gave a response a number of years ago to some of this talk at the beginning, so hopefully I'll be giving you some new arguments. But many of you will have heard of this famous case of a lesbian couple who wanted to deliberately conceive a child who was deaf like themselves, and they used artificial insemination from a deaf donor. They claimed that deafness is an identity, not a medical affliction. Their desire to have a deaf child was the outcome of pride and self-acceptance, that a hearing child would be a blessing and a deaf child, though, would be a special blessing, and that the child would be a valued and loved member of a real and supportive community. And this was often described in the media as deafness is not a disability. Another dilemma that doctors face is the question of whether to put cochlear implants into children of parents who are members of the deaf community. And in some cases, parents, for many of the same reasons, refuse for their young child to have a cochlear implant. Another example of people expressing different views about their bodies and their so-called disabilities is dwarfism. Achondroplastic dwarfs, as people from the deaf community sometimes access pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to deliberately select not a child without the mutation, but a child with the mutation, arguing that being small is not a disability, it's a difference. Their house and lifestyle are better accommodated to such a child, and they'd be better able to rear such a child. A more extreme example of the sorts of views people have about their bodies is body integrity identity disorder. This, I think, is now a part of DSM-5. It's described as a psychiatric disorder. These are people who don't identify with all four of their limbs, and they can often point to a line at which they cease to identify with that limb. They attend conferences with amputees and are sexually attracted to them, and they're often resistant to psychiatric counselling and treatment, and often attempt auto-amputation, putting their limb over a railway track, and will use prostheses if amputation was provided. These people seek what is standardly called in medicine a disability. And one of the other most controversial cases in bioethics from a few years ago, I think nearly 10 years ago now, was the Ashley case. Ashley was a 9-year-old girl in Seattle who was born with static encephalopathy, a severe brain disease, such that she would never develop cognitively beyond a 3 or 4 month old baby. But her body continued to grow in the normal way. And in 2004, high-dose estrogen therapy was provided to stunt her growth. Her uterus was removed to prevent menstrual discomfort, and her breast buds were removed to limit the growth of her breasts. Very disabling surgery. Her parents argued that this Ashley treatment was to improve the quality of their daughter's life. Her smaller size made it possible for them to include her in typical family gatherings and provide her with the needed comfort, closeness, security and love. Mealtime, trips, touch, snuggles, as she retained the size, at least, of an adolescent. These kinds of cases challenge our concept of what is a disability. The standard medical model, which I'll only briefly describe, can be called the species norm account of disability. This is a stable intrinsic property of someone that deviates from normal functioning for the species. So you're legally blind when your vision falls 2 standard deviations below the mean for vision. The problems with this view is that 2 standard deviations below the mean is a statistical point, but it says nothing about the level of function and indeed its impact at levels above 2 standard deviations below the mean. More importantly, it's a descriptive, not evaluative concept, and disability is in part evaluative. We speak of people suffering from a disability. If somebody said X has just become disabled, it wouldn't make logical sense to ask, well, but is that bad? Yet falling somewhere on a statistical curve implies nothing about whether that's good or bad for you. And indeed, loss of hearing, memory, sexual function are all completely normal as we get older, yet they're nonetheless disabling and a typical species norm account of disability can't account for the badness of normal decrements in function. In reaction to the medical model, the social model over the last 20 or so years has been developed that says statistical or biological deviations themselves have no moral significance, that people with disability are different or diverse. And as one author said, disability is a social problem that involves the discriminatory barriers that bar some people but not others from the goods that society has to offer. So on the social model of disability, which I'll go on to discuss in detail in a moment, disability is a stable intrinsic property of a person that deviates from normal functioning and which tends to reduce that person's well-being because members of society are prejudiced against that deviation. And it's part of a wider concept of a discriminated trait, which is a stable property which tends to reduce someone's well-being because members of society are prejudiced towards that property. Race, skin colour, sexual orientation or sex are all examples of discriminated traits. And adherents of the social model of disability claim that disability is just like having a discriminated form of race, sexual orientation or sex. Now, Guy Kahane and I, who have over the last few years done some work on reconceptualising disability, agree that the disability, the social model, singles out a genuine form of harm. The question that I want to ask today is, does this identify, does it capture everything that might be said about the evaluative connection between disability and well-being? Now, Francis responded to this paper where I defended a novel account of disability called the welfarist account that says disability is a stable physical or psychological property that tends to reduce somebody's well-being in a given set of social and environmental circumstances. It's a very broad concept. All of us are disabled to varying degrees. On this view, asthma is a disability, short sight is a disability, and the degree to which they're disabilities are the degree to which they tend to reduce well-being in the society in which we live. Now, prejudice, we agree with the social model, is bad, and we should certainly give priority to correcting prejudice. But are all reductions in well-being that disabled people suffer caused by unjust attitudes? It cannot be that prejudice exists just in the case that there is a conceivable possible world in which some putative disability has no effect on well-being. Paralysis, for example, may not make a difference at all if we have powers of levitation and telekinesis. Being deaf or mute would make little difference if we were all telepathic. But as Jeff McMahon has written in connection with misfortune, we have to consider realistic possible situations. So to close this section, in order to claim that all disadvantage associated with disability is the result of prejudice, we would have to show that all social arrangements which fail to promote everyone's well-being equally are unjust. We would have to accept something like absolute welfare equality, that any social arrangement which results in some members of society having, through no fault of their own, less welfare than others is unjust. And that's an extraordinarily strong requirement that I know of no one who subscribes to. It's a very implausible principle of distributive justice. It would imply that tall people are, we express prejudice against tall people if we don't raise the size of all door frames to enable tall people to not hit their heads as they walk through. Clearly, justice requires much more to people with disability than they receive, but whether it can achieve absolute welfare equality to us seems unlikely. Now, on to Elizabeth Barnes' discussion of the social model. This appeared in the most prestigious journal in my field, Ethics, so it's worthy of discussion. So Barnes is sympathetic, although she doesn't strictly endorse the social model. She says disability rights activists often claim that being disabled isn't something that's bad for you. Disability is rather a natural part of human diversity, something that should be valued and celebrated rather than pitied and ultimately cured. Having a disability makes you non-standard or different, but it doesn't by itself make you worse off. So for Barnes, it's the prejudice that makes people worse off. And she describes and endorses the mere difference view. Once we set aside the effect of common prejudice against the disabled, disability does not make a person overall worse off. It's merely a difference like gender or sexual orientation. So this is a very clear articulation of a view that has been promoted by disability advocates. And her target in this paper is an objection to this view. A very common objection that my colleague Guy Kahane has given, John Harris, Peter Singer, Jeff McMahon, at least Dan Wickler in company with his colleagues, Dan Brock, Norm Daniels and Alan Buchanan, that this would lead to unacceptable and counterintuitive implications. If disability were a mere difference, like hair colour or sex, it would be permissible to cause disability, and it would also be impermissible to cure disability. It will mean that prospective parents have no reason to prefer to create able-bodied children than disabled children. And it would mean that we're misguided in expending so many resources on developing ways of preventing or removing disability because it's just a difference. So an example Peter Singer gave me when I was a PhD student, it was exactly along this line. Imagine that a child has just been born and there's a condition that affects the child such that unless you put ointment in the child's eyes every day for 10 days, the child will go blind. It's obviously the right thing to do, and it would be unacceptable not to put the ointment in the child's eyes to prevent the blindness. This shows that blindness is a disability. This is the unacceptable implications objection to the mere difference view that Barnes takes issue at. So Barnes's goal in most of this paper is to argue that the mere difference view, whether or not it's true, doesn't entail that it would be permissible to cause non-disabled people to become disabled. It doesn't entail the unacceptable implications that Singer, McMahon, and many other philosophers have claimed it does. She also argues that it fails, the unacceptable implication objection fails to advance dispute between the defenders of the mere difference view and their critics. And when it does have force, it fails to have what she calls independent traction. That is, she means it's based on ableist intuitions. Intuitions that the only way these arguments have force is because they're based on intuitions that are already prejudiced against those with disability. Now, the mere difference view may allow that some disabled people's lives are worse or have lower well-being. But the mere difference view denies that this reduction in well-being is due to the disability itself. Instead, the negative effect on well-being is due only or largely due to social prejudice. Barnes contrasts the mere difference view with what she calls the bad difference view, which Guy Kahane and I renamed the detrimental difference view because we think it's more accurate, but the name doesn't really matter. Most of the conditions commonly described as disabilities, such as intellectual disability, blindness, deafness, and paralysis, are significantly likely to considerably reduce an individual's level of well-being in the contingent physical and social world that we actually inhabit. And that this would remain so even if prejudice were removed and social institutions improved. So the bad difference view says that disability is associated itself with some reduction, with some tendency to reduce well-being, just as asthma is associated with some tendency to reduce well-being. The adherents of the mere difference view, the social models, say there is no connection between, for example, disability or perhaps asthma and well-being. It's all about how society is constructed. That's the debate. Now, what the detrimental difference view does not say, and just to clarify, it doesn't say that disability is intrinsically bad or that it's necessarily a great harm, or that disability by itself is something that makes you worse off, or that disability always or nearly always leads to a reduction in well-being independently of one's contingent social and physical environment. We needn't believe that disability is bad. For example, we needn't believe that deafness is bad. The claim that those who adhere to the detrimental difference view is committed to is that just in the world in which we inhabit, disability tends to reduce people's good options even when we set aside societal prejudice against the disabled, and that they tend to make a person's life worse off. In another paper, we've argued deafness in certain worlds would be a positive advantage. For example, in an extremely noisy environment with deafening noise. If someone lacks a wide range of valuable options, then their quality of life is likely to be lower than someone who doesn't have those options. And our claim is that to lack certain basic sensory, physical or cognitive capacities in the world in which we actually inhabit is also to lack a broader range of valuable options and opportunities, as well as to find many of the remaining options significantly harder to pursue compared to the similar person who has those capacities. Now, Barnes's response to this is that the mere difference view also needn't deny that disability involves the loss of certain goods. So, for example, the deaf are unable to listen to music or hear a waterfall, hear the sound of the birds in the morning. It's just that the very same thing which causes you to lose out on some goods unique to non-disability allows you to participate in other goods, perhaps unique to disability. And there's evidence for this. There is neuroscience research that shows that the brain itself reprograms itself to utilise the areas that aren't stimulated by an absent sense. And people who are born deaf are better at processing peripheral vision and motion. So it's certainly correct that there may be advantages to having not have one sense in terms of enhancement of other sense. But to be compatible with the mere difference view, it isn't enough that disability has some benefits, even unique benefits, and that it also opens up some distinctive options. Almost anything will be associated with some potential advantage or will open up some new options. So you sometimes hear people who are diagnosed with cancer who say, for the first time, I felt really alive, or I found new meaning in life, or I did things that I would never have done before. This is not to argue that, therefore, cancer is not a misfortune. For the mere difference view to be viable, the positive effects have to at least balance or outweigh the negative effects. So some of the more commonly cited examples of the unique benefits are more intense personal relationships from always looking and visually attending to another's face, or participation in a unique culture. Now, even granted that there are these benefits, there is a certain asymmetry between being disabled and abled. So a deaf person cannot listen to classical music, but a hearing person can learn sign language. A hearing person can have a second order desire to remove the ability to hear, either temporarily or permanently, gaining access to the further options that perhaps require being deaf. Now, the ability to reprogram the brain is clearly not going to be the same if you become deaf as an adult as if you were born, but the extent of that advantage is not clear. At present, there's nothing a completely deaf person can do to access the options available only to those who can hear. So I'm focusing here on deafness because this is Barnes's example, and she doesn't deal at all with cognitive impairment or blindness. Now, it's doubtful to us, and I'll talk more about this in the second part of the paper, that although these experiences may have distinctive value, that they could confer benefits that outweigh the loss of options, even in a perfectly just society. So the key difference between the mere difference view and the detrimental difference view is whether prejudice and injustice are the only cause of loss of options. We agree with the advocates of the social model that the prospects of disabled people could and most certainly should be better than they actually are. And that may be the majority of this political discussion. But we also argue at a philosophical level that this does not alone account for the whole loss of options. Now, why the mere difference view does not make it permissible to cause disability. Half of Barnes's paper is committed to blocking the unacceptable implications objection. That if it's a mere difference, it's permissible to cause it, or to allow it to occur, or to fail to treat it. And she says, in general, the inference from X as a mere difference to causing X as impermissible isn't one we accept, and thus we shouldn't accept the inference from disability is a mere difference to causing disability is permissible. It's impermissible to cause a person to become different in some way, even if that difference doesn't have any impact on their well-being. So this is an indirect argument, but an important one to block the view that disability is associated with reduction in well-being. So she gives 3 grounds for thinking that it's impermissible to cause disability, even if it's a mere difference. And the first one is consent. She has some fantastic examples where people are blinded without their consent, and says this is clearly wrong. And to cause someone to change gender without their consent is to grossly interfere with their life, but we don't think that being a man or a woman is to be worse off simply because to change their sex without their consent is impermissible. And you can take an even more trivial example. It's impermissible to change someone's hair colour without their consent. It doesn't tell us anything about the value of hair colour. So she's certainly correct that changing somebody without their consent is generally impermissible. Her second argument is transition costs. Even if, say, being deaf is merely a difference, becoming deaf might be painful and demanding and therefore harmful. And again, similar considerations would apply to becoming a different sex or a different sexual orientation, or even losing your hair or having a different hair colour. The transition to a state may be difficult, but that doesn't imply that the end state itself is of less value. And again, we agree with this. And her third argument, though, is directed to cases where there are no transition costs and no questions of consent. For example, causing an infant to become disabled, or deafening a hearing infant, or failing to treat, as in Peter Singer's example, a condition that will render an infant disabled rather than abled. In these cases, there's no issues of consent or transition costs. So Barnes introduces a third factor, which is very vague, and she admits it's very vague. It's a criterion of non-interference. She argues that we oughtn't interfere in the natural state of an organism. So causing, again, she uses the parallels between sexual orientation and gender to drive this argument. Causing a male fetus to become female, she says, is deeply problematic, without thereby holding that being a female is worse than being a male. So the general principle is we should refrain from drastically altering a child's physical development. Now, the problem for Barnes is that this principle should be symmetrical in both directions. It should apply both to causing disability and removing it. And if her aim is to block the counterintuitive implications of the mere difference view, it fails here. because few people believe that removing a disability from a fetus is as wrong, or to use Barnes's terms, as impermissible as causing a male fetus to become female, or causing a fetus's hair colour to change from red to brown, or causing an able-bodied fetus to become disabled. So Barnes concedes that attempts to defend this asymmetry are not plausible. The proponents of the mere difference view need to endorse the symmetry. They must hold that it would be wrong to cause a deaf fetus or child to become hearing, or even to remove very severe intellectual and bodily disabilities. And they must also hold that doing that would be just as wrong as causing disability. And that's strongly counterintuitive. So, from this point, the second half of Barnes's paper is to give up on trying to defeat the counterintuitive implications of the view, and to argue that the intuitions that drive that unacceptable implications objections are themselves ableist, and so the objection fails to get traction. Essentially, she doesn't use this term, but we argue begs the question. So the objection begs the question. So failure to cure fetal disability is not problematic from the point of view of the mere difference view. These cases are only seem impermissible because we already believe that disability makes a life worse off. And this belief is caused by prejudice and ignorance, and these intuitions therefore have no force, she claims, against the mere difference view. Now, if a natural process is about to preventably turn an able fetus disabled, non-interference, if it implies anything, implies we should do nothing. But these are implications that many will find unacceptable. Barnes, in the end, doesn't deny these implications, but rather, as I said, argues that they're based on ableist intuitions. Further implications of the mere difference view are that it permits prospective people to create disabled children when they could easily create able-bodied children. It permits prospective parents to behave, even for frivolous reasons, in ways that cause a future child to be severely disabled. And resources and effort exerted in finding ways of preventing or removing disability are unjustified. Now, we have a long section of the paper where we argue that this claim that the sort of counterintuitive intuitions do have traction against this view in precisely the same way as intuitions function in many forms of arguments. For example, intuitions about utilitarianism. But since this is a general lecture, I'll leave that technical philosophical argument for those of you to read. I want to try to get at what is really at issue that I believe between people who hold the social model or the mere difference view and those who hold a detrimental view, a detrimental difference view. And I think it's something to do with a concept of well-being that's operative. So Barnes has responded on her blog to Guy Kahane and my article in very animated terms. And one of the things that she says is, what I object to without any reference to question begging is unsupported appeal to the assumption that disability is something bad or suboptimal. My claim is that if causation-based objections, causation-based objections being the unacceptable implication views, implicitly rely on such an assumption, they don't further debate. So she claims that the debate is no further. So, we remain with our counterintuitive intuitions at the end of her paper, and then her claim is, well, debate just isn't advanced anyway, so it's hard to see what the paper achieved if it was to deflate these and explain away these counterintuitive implications. But I think we get some sense of what her real concern is here. I think that such an assumption is unwarranted given the specific socio-political context in which we are discussing disability. Now, I said at the outset I have great sympathy for the privileged access that people have to their own lives and their conditions and their value. And certainly part of the value of those conditions is subjective. But those value claims still have to be evaluated. And Barnes agrees. She says, That's not all to say that what disability activists say about disability is sacrosanct or infallible. Far from it. It's just to say that you need very good reasons to say that the disability rights pride movement is systematically mistaken when they say that disability is not something bad or suboptimal. So here's Barnes's diagnosis in her response. This is not to charge those who make these objections with begging the question, as Guy and I suggested. It is to charge them with doing nothing more than relying on their intuition. Okay, so I'm going to give you an argument now that's not just relying on my intuitions. Okay. And what I think is going on here in this debate is that we have different commitments to value. Now, Barnes briefly discusses different conceptions of well-being, subjective and objective, in her paper, so the discussion is more complicated than I'm going to present, but here's a simplification of this kind of debate. I think many people in this debate, and in my experience in bioethics, subscribe to a subjectivist account of value. And indeed, these are the kinds of studies that Barnes refers to in her article. Or that they have some kind of threshold view of well-being. Now, what's the evidence that Barnes subscribes actually to a subjectivist view of well-being? She says in a footnote, current evidence suggests, for example, that non-disabled people are strikingly bad at predicting the life satisfaction and perceived well-being of disabled people. I completely agree with that. I completely agree with Barnes that non-disabled people are mistaken in the capacity, satisfaction, happiness of disabled people and the badness of disability. But the question we also have to ask is it bad in any way? And there are a number of problems with subjectivist views of value. These kinds of views dominate psychology, medicine, economics. The view is either that what is good for us is what makes us happy, or what we prefer. So the whole of economics is based on this view of value. Order your preferences, satisfy your strongest preferences. When you look at the work of Kahneman and Diner when people talk about well-being there, they talk about hedonometers, where happiness is measured during the day, or life satisfaction scores. Now, I think that hedonism and preference satisfaction are important components of well-being. The question is, are they the only components of well-being? And there are at least three problems for thinking that they are satisfactory alone to account for how we should evaluate life. The first problem is adaptation. And Barnes cites these studies. Going back to 1978, becoming a paraplegic has very negative effects in the short term in terms of subjective well-being. It causes a significant decrement in life satisfaction. However, over time, quality of life returns to nearly normal. Many paraplegics adapt to their state. If they are less happy than normal people, the difference is not great. And likewise, the same study shows that winning the lottery doesn't leave you in the long term any happier. So, the phenomenon of adaptation is a rule for human beings. Some insult occurs, hedonic satisfaction drops, and then the individual goes back to their baseline hedonic tone. The same applies if you lose a loved one. So my father died in 1998. I was very close to him. Today, my life, in terms of happiness and life satisfaction, is the same as it would have been if he'd been alive. In fact, it returned to its subjective state fairly soon after his death. And it's certainly true that the sadness that I experienced soon after his death made my life go bad. But does that sadness exhaust the badness of the loss of his life for my life overall? I'd argue that it doesn't. I'd argue that most of the badness of his loss is not captured by my happiness or life satisfaction. It's captured by the quality of our relationship, the sorts of things that we could do together, many objective elements. However, a subjective account of well-being, it's not really that bad at all, losing a loved one, because you'll get over it eventually. Secondly, well known to the philosophers, subjective accounts of well-being don't seem to track what's of value. One person may value their life with a very strong preference where they have 60 years to live, and another may have a very weak preference to live who's going to live for 80 years. And on a subjective account, it's purely a matter of how strongly they want to live. But how strongly we want to live is a function largely of our psychology. And indeed, how happy we are is largely determined by our hedonic set point. And in fact, as Hume himself openly recognised, people can desire anything. It's not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of your little finger. So these kinds of subjectivist views do poorly at capturing everything of value. They also fail to capture the importance of freedom, options, opportunities, or as Sen called them, capabilities. You can imagine two individuals who are equally happy or equally satisfied. The person who has more options, more freedom, has a life that is going better. So to give a relevant example, to be monolingual is to be less advantaged as it is to be bilingual. So imagine that I move with my family to China and I join an expat community. We all speak English. We all get on very well. Our lives are flourishing. Those lives are still not going as well as if my children learn Chinese as well as English. And indeed, the same applies to the ability of hearing children to both hear and speak and sign. And lastly, what I believe is deficient from most discussions of well-being and value in bioethics is an objective account of what makes a good life. Because these are controversial. But many influential philosophers have articulated objective accounts of well-being. Derek Parfit describes the good things in life as moral goodness, rational activity, development of abilities, having children, being a good parent, knowledge and awareness of beauty. Jim Griffin, accomplishment, autonomy, basic capabilities and liberty, understanding, enjoyment, deep personal relations. Objectivist theorists include Aristotle, Plato, Aquinas, Leibniz, Adam Smith, Hegel, Marx and Nietzsche. One thing that's basic about human beings is they're social animals, and the quality and number of their social relationships is an important aspect of their well-being. This is a basic objective criterion. Now, Parfit famously argues, and I think this is right, that the best life is the intersection of these three circles. It's engaging in objectively valuable activities that give us happiness that we wish to engage in. So, the implications of this are that to evaluate any state, like my children's lives after separation and divorce, or like asthma, or like blindness, or like intellectual disability, is not only to examine the preferences those individuals have or the happiness of those individuals, but also their ability to engage in some list of objectively valuable activities. And since we don't have an agreed upon operationalisable list, it's impossible to actually evaluate how good or bad those states are. And we also certainly don't have large-scale surveys of these conditions to evaluate their impact on well-being. So we're hypothesising. But in order to answer the question, does disability or does deafness make life go worse, we would have to answer that. Now, I also hear on many occasions that ethics is relative, and I think this is deeply wrong. But there's a sense in which it is correct. It's relative to context. As I argued before, deafness would be an advantageous state in a very noisy environment. For this reason, we've defined disability in welfarist terms as a stable biological or psychological trait that tends to increase or reduce well-being in a given set of social and natural circumstances. But we can predict the likely environment. For example, dyslexia may not have been significant, or indeed it may have been associated with abilities that were of an advantage in the African savannah. But in the environment people are likely to be exposed to, it's a significant disadvantage. Impulse control, one of the most fundamental all-purpose goods, and intelligence are both traits that are of great advantage in today's contemporary environment. And we've made the argument that deafness, although it could be an advantage in certain environments, is likely to be overall a disadvantage objectively, not subjectively, objectively, in the actual world. Now, of course, that's contestable. Studies could show that deaf people, their lives go as well, if not better, than the average person's on both objective and subjective criteria. Okay, the other thing that I think might be going on in Barnes's arguments and these arguments is a commitment to satisficing. That if injustice were removed, many or perhaps most people with disabilities would have very good lives, perhaps even the best of lives. And if one accepts a satisficing view of well-being, they've crossed the line. Their lives are good enough, and I think that's probably true. I think that's leaving aside cognitive disabilities, but sensory disabilities, motor disabilities, I think, can certainly have very good lives. And as a political and social goal, getting people above this threshold may be the most important thing. But we're asking here a different question about whether their lives are expected on average to be the same or worse in terms of well-being. And even this question is not enough, because individuals can have the best of lives. What we're asking, as I asked in the first question about asthma, is whether over large numbers of these people, their lives are likely to be lower in subjective and objective value. So does disability represent an impediment to having the best potential life, both in subjective and objective terms, in a fully just society? And our answer is yes. That's why disability is not mere difference. Okay, there's one last objection that I frequently encounter, and then I'll finish, and that is the objection that I started with. I said I've had a stunningly good life, and I've had to overcome several obstacles, but one of them was a sort of mild to moderately severe illness when I was young. And I often hear the argument that the best lives require overcoming obstacles to make us better people. And the response to that is adults ought to be able to choose which impediments they want and which they choose to remove. Absolutely right. But when it comes to children who aren't yet born, they ought to start life with the least impediments. They will, as a part of the probabilistic nature of life, face many social, natural, psychological and biological misfortunes. And they'll have the choice to decide which of those to overcome and how to overcome them. After all, we will all certainly age and die later if we are lucky. Now, I'll finish here. One thing I was looking to see whether there was a blind culture as is a deaf culture, and the first article that came up was by the president of the Blind Society in Ohio, arguing that there is no such thing as a blind culture. And she wrote this rather thoughtful blog, and she said that a separate culture develops when barriers exist interrupting the communication between members. So she says Hispanic people, or any group using languages other than English as their preferred tongue, often draw together and communicate in their own language. They have a distinctive cuisine, literature, music, and even religion. And they may function in the larger society but naturally gravitate towards others who share their life experience. Which is the same thing applies to the deaf culture. And she says, it's not uncommon for deaf parents to be relieved when they learn that their baby is also deaf, so that they will not have to constantly live in two cultures. And she goes on to say that blind people are able to function perfectly so they don't form these kinds of cultures. Now, according to Pierce, being a part of the deaf culture is analogous to being part of a Hispanic culture in an Anglo-American society. But are these cultures mutually exclusive? Surely what we should aim for is integration with preservation of what's unique to each culture. We should teach children in these areas both Spanish and English. And an inability to learn one language in a mixed culture would be a disability. So in the case of the deaf culture, the implication would be we ought to be learning sign language in school, not that we ought to be arguing that deafness is not a disability. Okay, lastly, another confusion that people have is to confuse descriptive equality with prescriptive equality. To claim that everyone is equal in the prescriptive sense is to say that everyone ought to be treated equally. They ought to have an equal chance to participate in the goods of society. So if one person has a longer life expectancy than the other, according to egalitarianism, they ought to have an equal chance of life-saving treatment. And the same would apply to disabilities. So although utilitarianism and cost-effectiveness analysis is inegalitarian in this way, prescriptive equality and egalitarianism can respect the equal claims of each individual. Each person ought to be given an equal chance to receive the best chance of the best quality of life and the longest life for him or her. Okay, so when it comes to choosing to be disabled or non-disabled, the views of autonomous individuals ought to be respected. When it comes to embryos, fetuses and children, we ought to choose to avoid disability, not because it guarantees a better life, but because it increases the chances of having a better life, just as removing a disposition to short sight or asthma. On a welfarist account, all of us are disabled, just to varying degrees. There are 4 ways to promote human well-being and alleviate disability. You can change the natural environment, the social environment, psychology or biology. Which of these you choose doesn't depend on the etiology. It depends on the costs, the benefits, the requirements of justice, the desires of people, and many other factors. So this model is not wedded to a biological interventionist model in disability, even if we accept that there is something detrimental about disability. It can still be wedded to the view that the most effective way of improving well-being is social. Okay, let me finish there and take questions. Thank you.
So we've got time for questions, and we've got microphones in the back. Dan?
Julian, I want to take off from the last sentence of the last slide, the one that's bolded here. You mentioned at various points in the talk that in environments that are likely or the ones that people are actually going to be in, people who have these disabilities are not going to be able to function as well. Although maybe if the environment were very, very different, they might. But you said that as if the decision, as if the question of how the environment will be is just a given, like the Earth is round, and so why talk about what life would be like if it were flat? But in fact, as you know, of course, whether a given condition that you have is truly disabling, and whether it bars inclusion in ordinary social affairs depends in part on how it's set up, and if there's a special effort made so that people with various traits don't find having those traits to be a barrier that they can't overcome, they do better. So a very simple one is curb cuts.
Which one?
Making the edge of the curb on sidewalk go down toward the street. That makes it possible for someone in a motorized chair to go great distances, whereas before that, absolutely impossible. And so now they are simply not, they're not shut in, they're not immobile to nearly the same extent, and the cost is virtually nil.
Yeah.
Now, we can do a lot like that, and as we do it, the things that stood out as disabilities because they were disabling no longer do, because they're not disabling, they're just traits. So it's not a given. Now, the thing about that is that some accommodations that we could make would be highly inconvenient. So, for example, I'm tall. I find ordinary stairs to be a bit on the short side. I wish the rise was higher. I could handle that fine, and I'd get places faster. But people who are very, very short struggle with the risers that we have. Now, to accommodate them, we could have a law that all staircases had to have at most 3 inches of rise between steps. But we don't want to put up with that. Now, the last sentence here acknowledges this. It says, look, you have to look at all the costs, all the benefits, and so on. And so maybe there's something to be said for saying what's good for the majority who have the abilities that these people who are in this situation disabled have, lack, sorry. What's best for the majority should rule because of the huge cost to them of accommodating. So it's a two-way, it's a real question each time whether or not we should be inclusive. Well, but the thing is that it is a question, and it's a question of justice each time, right? Not just a fact.
Yeah. No, it's a question of justice. So you have to answer the question: what does justice require? And then make and it may be that justice requires spending a lot of money on the minority, or it may be it doesn't. That's not unique to this debate. It's a general challenge we face. But I mean, I thought you were going to get at this because you have this very nice example in your book from 2000, where you talk about playing a card game with a group of people with different intellectual abilities. Some are intellectually disabled and some are able-bodied. And if everyone is to participate, you have to play Go Fish, I think was the example. Right.
Yeah, that was further developed in my 1980 article.
Right, so you've got this example of play Go Fish. Okay, and then everyone could play Go Fish, be pretty boring for the people who weren't intellectually disabled, but everyone could be included. Or you could cognitively enhance the people who have intellectual disability, and you could play bridge. Okay. Now, what does justice require in that case? I think it's an interesting question. I think overall, those are the sorts of, there isn't any predetermined answer whether we ought to do the social or the biological. And in that case, I'd be inclined for the biological because it has positive externalities. So there are a lot of reasons, and this is what I mean, it's context dependent. People want to know, well, should we be changing society or should we be changing people? And the slogan always goes in the disability debate, change society, don't change people. And it just depends on the facts of the particular. So I don't know how much money should be spent on stem cell therapy or altering curbs. It's impossible to stand here and say that without knowing how much the total cost is, what the prospects are for change, etc. So, in that sense, I think we ought to be open to all possibilities, and as you say, operate a theory of justice. It's not an inevitable, but in some cases, society is very difficult to change. I mean, you can't assume that social change is going to necessarily be the only way or even the preferred way. It will depend on the facts. So is that enough of an answer to that question, or do you want to?
I'll just put in one more word on it. One question that comes up when you try to figure out how much is too much is the value of inclusion itself. If you could make this disability not be a disability by inclusion, how much value should we place on that? And that's a pretty difficult question.
Yeah, I agree that social, as I mentioned, this sort of kind of respect, social inclusion, social relationships, hugely important part of community functioning and also individual well-being. If people aren't warring with each other in a society, they're also happier. So it has that. So you're right, that's a very important fact to include in the calculation. So yes, and it may be that we ought to be much more accommodating, more egalitarian, like the Scandinavian countries, and spend a lot more in social welfare than we do. And those are certainly benefits that you would need to include.
I want to pick up on this question of the theoretical versus the applied aspect of this a bit more. And I come at this from the viewpoint, I'm a lawyer. I've brought many cases on disability rights, especially in the area of education. And I'm really taken with Barnes' statement that you need very good reasons to counter the mere difference view. That is powerful. And the fact is, you can say in theory, what is justice? How much change should we bring about? How much should we devote to this and that? But in the real world, we are so far from doing as much as we can do to overcome physical barriers and psychological barriers and discrimination, that maximizing the view that it's society's fault and we could eliminate many of these impediments, we could eliminate a huge number of impediments, is really a very important philosophy. So I find this kind of discussion, I understand theoretically it's very intriguing, but it's also very disabling in a way.
Well,
Of course,
so-
it undermines the reality that pushing the mere difference view as far as possible in the real world will get you to real improvement. It's not going to get, you know,
Well,
some ideal environment where you can
I agree, it's an interesting
reshape things.
position that politically we should adopt the social model, and that will have the best effects. So that's an interesting claim. Even if it's not, on my view, completely correct, it's 90% correct, and we shouldn't bother with the extra 10% because we're actually going to bring about worse change if we try to communicate the complexity. So I take seriously that view, and I've done similar things in the past myself in political arguments. For example, the cloning debate. I see there are no good objections to reproductive cloning except for safety. But when it comes to going to, you know, the equivalent of your Congress or whatever and giving evidence, I say reproductive cloning is immoral. It's therapeutic cloning we want. Because it's very important we get through the laws that allows that sort of research. So I agree with you, there is this divide between the political and the strictly philosophical. Okay? And what I've been trying to do is the strictly philosophical. However, as a doctor, I just want to say this. I mean, one of the most vivid memories I had, you know, when I was working in the emergency department as a registrar, young girl in her 20s, was drunk, rolled her car, and severed her spinal cord high up, wasn't ventilator dependent. She was in there, and the neurosurgical registrar had to say, you know, you'll never walk, you'll never move your arms again, and sort of a small tear came to her eye. Now, I agree there's a lot you can do for that girl, and, you know, you can make her life a lot better, but you're never going to make it the same. And I think that gets lost, and, you know, it is a tragedy. It was a tragedy for her. And no matter what we do, it is a tragedy, and I'm happy to say that, having, you know, seen those sorts of situations. Another example, my mother has dementia. It's a tragedy to see somebody's cognitive abilities just wither and decline. And, you know, sometimes she's happy, and maybe she'll end up being happy, satisfied. Still a tragedy. And you also have these cases where parents come in with their kid who could hear if you put a cochlear implant, and they say, we don't want our child to have a cochlear implant because we want the child to be deaf like us. Now, are you going to use that child as a political instrument for social change and say, well, we don't want to challenge this view that it's just a difference and everything is socially constructed, and so I think that's also the pointy end of this. So unfortunately, there's lots of ends where it's ugly, and it's not, you know, it's not going to be solved by a kind of very simplistic approach like, well, let's just embrace the difference view and the social model, and we should certainly be doing that. You know, we should certainly be, because, you know, the reality is, you know, even if you're purely self-interested, all of us can be disabled in that sense. So you should make people's lives go as well as possible. So there's no doubt about that. But then the question is, what are you going to say to those parents who don't want their child to have a cochlear implant? And on the basis of the arguments I've given, I don't think they should be allowed to do that. Even though the child will have a great life in their community, the child will still have a great life in their community if the child can hear. And you've got to take a position on these things when you're the doctor there and they're making that claim. So, you know, I think these things, you know, what I find in this area is that there is, you know, a debate amongst groups of people, but there's a lot more people, you know, out who are facing disabilities besides the people who are involved in the debates. So you want to make so.
Francis actually got the mic next. We'll
Yeah.
get Francis, then we'll bring the mic up here.
I don't know if it's working. Is it on? Hold it close, but then I'll get a disease. I mean, it's got germs.
Doesn't matter. It's just a difference.
Oh, there's a doctor in the room. Right, I forgot. So one thing, I just want to, oh, you're assuming I'm sick, right, okay. The thing is that one addition you could make to strengthen your argument is that Kahneman himself, when he did the surveys of the adaptation, points out that even though the people in the survey said, I'm just as happy as I was and I don't expect to be happier, but I'd like to be cured of my disability. People who've had burn scars or so forth, or have lost limbs, I would like to have it back. And he himself is very puzzled about this because he's got this subjective view of value. He doesn't understand how could that be so. You might point that out. But the questions that I had were, your view at the end seemed to imply that if an adult chose to blind themselves or have themselves blinded because they thought that living a harder life or in some way making things more difficult for themselves in that way would make them live a better moral life on the objective value, or give them a sense of what it was to hear music, or that would be okay, and that if you were a doctor who was asked to do that, you might not have problems with complicity or anything of that sort in the person doing something that was gravely bad for themselves. Or, even allowing a person who is a doctor themselves and knows how to take out their optic nerve on their own somehow, not interfering with that individual. I mean, after a certain point where you judge their mental state and so forth, you say, yeah, go ahead. There isn't any big mistake in judgment that you are making. Seem to me to be too concessive on this issue. But my one question, if I may still add a second question, is that you talk about, on average, a certain trait will lead you in the society as it is now to have a less good life on the objective and subjective. So if I had 6 hands, if I had 6 hands and 4 legs, and a much better brain, of course, right, I would be, by not having these things, I'm really not doing as well as I could, even in our current society. Okay, and I'm much more handicapped relative to that state I could have had, right, than I would be if I were maybe deaf or even blind, okay, in this society, all right? The gap between well-being would be enormous, right, because I lack those things and if I could have had them. So is your view also going to imply, given that you don't want to be asymmetrical, that not only if someone came in with these, 6 legs and, 6 arms and an enormous brain, and we weren't prejudiced, we were just in awe. I mean, I wish I were like that. Look how well they do. Much better than I'm doing, right? You would not only not interfere with that, but you would do it to people if the young child, if it were possible. I mean, that seems to be a logical implication of your view, because all you said
You're always good with the logic,
current
Francis.
society, pardon me?
You're always good with the logic, you're right.
Well, no, I mean, but that seems to be directly implied by your view.
I have this very strange view that there is a spectrum all the way from completely enhanced to completely disabled, okay? And it's just a continuum, okay?
So you're not focusing on normal species function.
No, I don't
that's what
care.
you're trying to reach,
Normal
right.
species, that's just a matter of evolution. So, the thing with your 6 arms and two brains and so on is it's just impossible. If it suddenly became, we could click our fingers, you would be very disadvantaged not having that, especially if everyone else had it.
Well, I'm already disadvantaged in the sense, no, this is not a positional thing that everyone
No, but you're also absolutely disadvantaged.
I am absolutely disadvantaged right now,
Yeah, you
and
are, but
more
there's
so
nothing
than
we
I
can do
would
about it,
if
so
I became deaf.
it's not really...
I lose out on doing a lot more things by not having those characteristics.
No, in theory you are, but there's nothing that we can do to satisfy
But
it.
if we could, your view implies that we should,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it does imply that.
But what
But
about amputation?
okay, amputation. So this one, so I was very quick there. So getting back to so I think people ought to be allowed to do what they want if they're competent adults and that's what their view of the good, even if they're mistaken. So let's go back to the actual real case of the amputees that want to be amputees. This is a case where somebody comes in wanting a normal, healthy limb amputated. Okay, what do I think a doctor should do? Well, the first question you should ask is it better for the person to have the amputation? So will this be correlated with a higher level of well-being or a lower level of well-being? And I think it's quite plausible it's associated with a higher level of well-being, because they're not going to change their desire through psychotherapy and psychiatric medication. They're going to try auto-amputation. The studies show they are happy when their leg is amputated. They do use a prosthesis. So actually, you know, on both the subject, they seem to be, seems to be the kind of better decision. But let's assume it wasn't. So I think they should be done in real life. 3 of them were done in Scotland, and then the NHS stopped them because it was inflicting disability. But let's assume that actually you don't think they're going to be better, okay? Then I think that's like selling somebody cigarettes. You know, it's, do you think the people have the right to make decisions that are bad for them? And how far will you go in assisting them in making bad decisions? That's just the sort of garden variety dilemma. It depends on how committed you are to doing good. I'm not particularly a do-gooder. You know, I would prefer to respect what, if I was a doctor in that situation, I would go through it. Don't think this is going to be good for you, but if this is what you really want, we'll do it. But for children, you really have to have a clear view that it's the right thing before you amputate a limb. So, you know, to take an example, it may be that there's partial. I'll give you some there's. I had to write this thing for a disability journal, which is really interesting. The disabled are going to become super-abled, because as technology advances, the things that they're given to augment them are going to surpass natural abilities. So one US Marine who broke both his ankles very badly in Afghanistan, could only sort of walk with pain a short distance, wanted both his legs amputated so he could participate, so he could use prostheses and also participate in the disabled Olympics with blades like Oscar Pistorius. And they asked me, what do you think about amputating, you know, legs in this situation? And I think fine. Plausibly it's going to improve his well-being, and it's also what he wants. But it's not what medicine standardly does.
But he's not making his life harder in order to get other sorts of goods.
Yeah, look, again, you know, making your look. I think liberty is a very important thing, and liberty only kicks in when you disagree with what people are doing. And if you're really serious about respecting it when you think that they're doing the wrong thing. And insofar as these people are affecting, of course there's the resources issue and how much they're going to use in healthcare, etc. That's a separate argument. But if it's only harming themselves in their life, then although I think it's the wrong thing, I would advise them not to do it. You know, I think that there's an argument that you can support their decision. But I'm not very Christian, or I don't have a strong sort of desire to save people. Sorry.
So I'm just a lowly first-year undergraduate, so I'm not quite as learned, and I'm just going to present a personal example. So I have cystic fibrosis. It's like you probably know what it is, but so it does make my life harder. It's a genetic foot-by disease. I have a shortened life expectancy. I cough up fluid every day, and I get very sick, and it does make my life harder. And I think morally it's acceptable if people were to come up with a cure to cure cystic fibrosis, like cure fetuses with cystic fibrosis, and to like introduce cures to adults. Personally, I don't know how I would feel about a cure, since right now cures are questionable. But I think at the same time it's also important to focus on kind of how, I'm sick right now, and people who are disabled right now, the view that our lives are only bad, and that the social structure. I think the social structure plays a bigger role than just the fact that disability is bad. Being sick is hard, and it presents personal challenges, and I think I can't just say that disability is only a difference. I think that I have to acknowledge that disability does make life more difficult, But whether or not that difficulty is bad is something that's questionable and depends on the individual. In my personal case, I'd say that, well, it's hard, and I definitely would say that my life isn't the norm, or that I can get through things as easily. I feel like I have been given many advantages by my disease. I appreciate life more. I don't think I'd be a Harvard student if I didn't have my disease, because it pushed me to go to education, etc. But at the same time, it is more difficult, and it is made more, like, even more difficult by the social structures that are in place. For example, just coming here to the college, like, I can't, if I'm sick in the hospital, I can't get to my class. And like in high school, I would Skype in, but here they're like, oh, you can't, or like they're making it very difficult. So there are methods in place in which I can live my life in a similar way to my peers. It's made more difficult by society. So there is, I think there's, it's much more in between. Like, we can't, it's really difficult to be clear cut when you're talking about disability, because there are so many different types of disability. And I think, like, deafness comes up a lot because I think it is more widely studied and there is a greater culture to it. But in terms of like chronic illness, especially as a disability, and like more invisible disabilities or mental disabilities, it becomes a more fine line on what is normal, and like how for each person does it make life bad. Because I know plenty of people who would say, like, my disability does not make my life bad. Like, you know, it's a very personal question, and you know, I think there is a little bit more of a moral gray in terms of how much we can say that for everyone disability is bad, or it makes life more difficult.
Well, I completely agree with everything you said. So, you know, if I were, just to go back to the deaf community one, if I were living on a deaf community and involved in some form of deaf art, and I was a deaf leader, then, you know, it would be a mistake to correct my deafness. It would be, actually, I'd be living the best life, and deafness would be a part of that. So I agree with that. And I think many people, I think the sort of one of the main points that you're making is many people misunderstand the capacities of other people. And one of the complaints that this lady Pierce was saying is that, you know, 90% of blind people aren't employed, not because they can't do the job, but people just think they can't do the job. So I think that I completely agree that there's a lot of misunderstanding and misvaluing and prejudice and all of that from the political point of view is the main target. So I agree, you know, we ought to be doing a lot better. I guess we were interested in trying to think through how should you think about disability today as a general challenge that is a part of society changing and our concepts having been developed hundreds of years ago and often not having been revised. And disability is one that is now straining as people say, no, I'm not disabled, I'm just different. And there's also technology that will mean they actually can function better than people who don't have that condition. And we have to try to rethink what we really mean and what really matters. That was really the point of this sort of little... But I agree with you. And another thing which I didn't say here is a large part of the benefits of these conditions which blindness doesn't is the community. And I know so there was a strong CF community. And that gave meaning to a lot of people and was a big source of value that you wouldn't have were it not for that condition. So I agree with you. It's very complex, and so at a political level, I agree with you. You should be able to Skype in, and all of those things we ought to change.
Thank you.
One more question, Chris. Thank you. Julian, I'm sympathetic with your conclusion that disability is not mere difference. But given that you ended by drawing the line between adults and non-adults in the way we should respond to it, I'm almost puzzled about why you need it. One of the things you didn't touch on in your paper is what we think the right reasons for having children are. And it's not a disadvantage to be a carpenter, but we would think something wrong with parents who somehow manipulated their child in the womb so that the only thing he or she could do is be a carpenter. It's not a disadvantage to live in the Hispanic community, but we would think something wrong with parents somehow raise their child so the only way they could possibly live is in the Hispanic community. So it seems to me a lot of your argument can be done just on the basis of whether parents have the right to limit their children's options in certain ways, without saying anything about whether disability.
Look, I completely agree. And when years ago when I showed Derek Parford this paper, he said, well, I agree with everything you say, except you should just get rid of that word disability and replace it with disadvantage. And a lot of the things that you're exactly right. The reason why I wouldn't operate on a child with an intersex condition now is that it will, in one sense, give them more options in the future. So we could just talk about what is option maximising or what's welfare promoting and use those terms. The only reason that we've used this term is because it figures in the law, it figures in public debate, people use it all the time, and one of the jobs of philosophy is to try to analyse and define carefully what people mean. And and we tried to introduce a novel concept which hasn't really sort of taken off because it's so far away from the normal concept. But I agree with you. The things that really matter are what are you going to do, how are you going to treat children, how are you going to treat yourself, and the words that you give are irrelevant. And what matters, is autonomy and well-being. And I think what's really important, I guess with the project, I think a lot of the mistakes that are made in medical ethics and bioethics are because people have this purely subjectivist view about the good, and it's it's the bane of modern society that it's just what the consumer is always right. It's give the consumer what they want. It's all just about desires, and so that bit I think that is the really important bit. But I agree, the term. And what you're seeing with disability, I think, is it's not really a term that's very useful any longer because people are meaning different things. They want to achieve different things. They're drawing attention to prejudice, or they're drawing attention to the connection to the objective good life, and people are talking past themselves. So I agree with you. Thank you.
Let's thank Professor Savulescu.